right. Happy Tuesday, everyone, and welcome back to another Learning Tech Talks, where we are exploring all things learning tech and innovation. And I am joined by Todd Moran, and you've been on the show before.
True story.
We were just talking about this. It's been almost 2 years now. I think it might even be more than that.
I think you've got it. I think I had us time stamped in January of 2021. So
it was
past
2
that
years.
mark.
Yeah. And you had just started at NovoEd, hadn't you?
Correct. I think I was a scant month or so into
because I remember it was a last minute shift. You weren't originally going to be the guest, and then it was like, well, Todd's here now. We should have Todd on the show. And it was like, okay, well, then I guess I'll hang out with Todd for an hour.
It was a pleasure. I made my transition from Edcast over to NovoEd, so it was timely, and I appreciate you slotting me in.
Hey, well, you know what? And I'm sure a lot has changed in 2 years. So today, for those of you watching and listening, we're going to be talking about collaborative learning, but we're going to get into unpacking that more because that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And we're going to get into all sorts of things like scalability, the skills behind it, what the future of that looks like. But for those who may not be as familiar, because as I was saying right before we went live, I have a conversation in May with 360 Learning, and they also talk about collaborative learning. But it's a very, very, very different world. Like, we're not talking about the same thing, even though we're using the same words. So for those who may not be as familiar with NovoEd and what it is and the space it plays in, how do you describe that to other people to help demystify that?
Yeah, the vernacular always a challenge, Christopher. I find that. So think of us like this. NovoEd is a cohort-based learning platform, all focused on building capabilities for large-scale enterprises. It at its okay. Sort of most simplistic view. And if I were to unpack that with another 30 seconds, what we're trying to come in and do is oftentimes sit in complement to existing investments folks have made in their tech stack, and really power this sort of human element experience where we're tying this sort of mashup of content and learner and manager, facilitator, all into sort of one cohesive experience across sort of a long form arc, and solving for big things like transformation and global upskilling and DE&I and leadership. And oftentimes for us, that really takes the shape of large scale enterprises. So we're serving the 2,500 or thinking about large scale enterprises in terms of tens of thousands of users is really our sweet spot. And we also power some of the sort of the largest external training providers out there in terms of extended enterprise, exec ed programs, and external training firms.
Yeah, because that was one of the things I remember from our last time, that you span the gamut in that, because when you really think about, yes, there's a ton of really extremely useful use cases. Can I say that? I can. It's my show. I can say whatever I want. But internally, but also this stuff spans, I just think of the use cases very broad, not just narrowly. And I think when I think about this, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but when I think about what we're talking about today in terms of collaborative learning, it's in many ways this transition from learning as an event to an experience, and moving this transition from, hey, learning's this thing that happens in a moment of time, which we all know just by default that's not, any skill you can learn in 15 minutes is probably not that valuable of a skill. So, it's not like if you can watch something and go, there, now I'm a master at that. I don't know that it really is a skill that you'd want to put on your resume. So when I think about moving to this longer form journey, it really is going into this experience of saying, look, skills take time and effort and energy, and that doesn't happen in a moment. And a lot of technology is not really designed to support that well.
Yeah, that long form arc is such an important one. And in many ways, I think of that as being the big defining characteristic of the desire of this modern learner today is don't make it event-based. Don't make it episodic. Make it continuous by design, by its very nature. So we often see a lot of our clients deploying NovoEd across multiple use cases and taking on a capability academy type construct, right? Where can I co-locate, tens of thousands of learners through extended programs and experiences where it can be shared experience through that. And it's not just consumption of sort of raw content and asset, but sort of weaving in these threaded discussions and polls and opportunities to submit work products and doing it in that really important point, the space learning piece, which is a sort of a core pedagogical tenet that that we take to heart in terms of the platform, because you can't just do it once. If I'm practicing objection handling as a sales rep or you have to do this with repetitive nature and then get feedback with that from peers and mentors and managers. And when you put all that together into a cohesive experience, one of our big tenets of kind of investment areas, that's NovoEd at its core.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and I know the academy terminology has spun up. I think that's become a bit of a industry buzzword.
Yeah.
It's probably been, a good year and a half. But I think that kind of thinking, which even I was skeptical when the term first started coming out, because I'm like, oh, are we just rebranding, the corporate university as an academy? Which in some cases, that is what's happening. It's like, hey, we renamed this our academy now versus our university. And it's like, well, this is still the same thing. But what we're talking about is the actual transformation of,
yes,
we know we're trying to build these skills in people. We know that's not going to happen overnight. So how do we actually architect? And like you said, right, build the arc that people need to actually do that. And my experience has been technology, at least the standard tech stack, does not do that very well.
No, I think it's, this is, and I can claim this because I spent, first 15 years of my career on the customer side running large scale L&D teams, and the last 8 of which I was at Schneider Electric on the digital transformation, business transformation. But then on the provider side, watching this arc, of places that I was at, like EdCast, an incredibly powerful piece of technology is a LXP, to throw more vernacular at folks, but, basically aggregating and creating discovery of short form content, and stringing together things in a playlist, blog post after article after video, is that really producing? Am I ready to perform in my job? And I think, that's the place where we're coming in and seeing clientele saying, is there another way to go about doing this to solve for this sort of performance readiness aspect, and to know that I've had to submit multiple examples of a work product into my cohort, have it peer reviewed on multiple occasions across a 5-week span, and have a mentor assess a formal rubric tied to that, all the while threaded discussions. Like, that's a very different experience than just stringing together a playlist.
Well, and I think this goes to the conversation of transitioning from knowledge to skills, because I tend to be sometimes it drives people nuts because they think I sit the fence on this, but I'm like, it's not that. It's that there's a whole lot of complexity to things that often goes unaccounted for. And so when we talk about this, it's not sitting here pointing the finger saying, oh, these other things, they're bad, don't do. It's like, well, no, they have a place because there's a knowledge building component that has to happen. And these things happen differently than, hey, we've got a core set of job skills that we need to build into a select group of people that we know all need this similar experience to be able to do. They fit together well, but I think sometimes we end up trying to be MacGyver, being like, well, how do we make all this happen with paper clips and rubber bands? And it gets really, really, really messy.
It does. I oftentimes prescribe like that adage of, if you think of skill as knowledge of a topic or system, capability is the ability to perform in a work setting. And those are two very different things. You pick and you name the job and name the role, name the vertical, name the industry. I think you could describe those in different manners, which begs the question, what's the most sort of ideal way to go about developing those? And so obviously we've got a vantage point on that, but I think a lot of people could struggle with that still today.
So on this topic, since it's been 2 years and, a few things have happened since 2021, I don't know, it's been a bit of a while, just a handful. But on this one, I am curious because 2020 hit, pandemic hit, everybody went virtual, everything was virtual. Now I'm seeing kind of mixed reviews. People are what are you seeing in the way people are designing these collaborative experiences, in the sense of, are people still kind of sticking to hybrid? Are they returning to in-person? Are they doing whole digital? What are you seeing across the mix? I'm actually really curious how people are approaching it.
Yeah, I think so a mix. I think gamut in many
Okay.
ways. I think you've got certain verticals and industries where there is a demand to come. This return to office is real in this sort of forced dynamic. Now, I think what L&D teams and talent and HR teams are going, if we're smart and we can't bring everybody back, let's think about this sort of hybrid work in perpetuity. Then let's match up to that in sort of like for like. So I think we're seeing a whole lot more on the blended side where, yes, a sort of a digital first approach is fantastic because of the scalability that we've been able to sort of create over the past 3 years or 2 years. We know we can do it, but we also, folks are sort of clamoring for these opportunities for sort of in-person that's not pure play virtual. So, being able to sort of programmatic design that takes into account multiple opportunities, whether that's short form boot camp where you're physically co-located for a little bit, and then there's a continuation of pre, during, post that happens in digital, or it's much longer form. And it's a 18-month developmental program where there are opportunities for some on-site opportunities, and maybe you're flipping that classroom bit, but the cohesiveness and the cohesion of the experience still staying in that digital fashion because one, it scales incredibly well, and two, it creates the sense of diversity. Who else can come to that? Am I in the office in Manhattan, or am I there in Hong Kong, or doesn't matter where I am, I can participate in that experience.
Well, and so I use this phrase a lot and it gets misunderstood plenty of times, but you used it, and I want to call it the point about being digital first in your thinking, I think is such a critical component. And sometimes that's interpreted as, oh, digital first, you're just trying to make everything online. And it's like, that is not at all what I'm saying. And even what we're talking about here, because just in the examples you gave, this is not designing for this community cohort arc kind of skill building academy, whatever. Let's throw as many buzzwords as we can.
We'll get them all in.
Right. But when you think about this, it's not about saying, okay, it's either online, or if it's not online, then we just don't think this way. It's like, well, no, it's about actually thinking about how can technology optimize the experience, which is what you just got at. And again, I think this hits at that equity conversation big time when we think about leadership development, when we think about a lot of the development activity that happens. The ability to go off to training, that's a luxury that many people often don't realize is a luxury for people. And there's a lot of people that is not accessible. The reality of, look, I just can't make that happen. And I may be hyper attuned to it as a dad of 7, but like, this is a real thing that, thinking digitally first and saying, okay, yeah, maybe there's that component to this, but how do we make sure we're accounting for the fact that can't be an exclusionary factor for participants, or we're basically writing off a large portion of our audience?
Massively. I mean, I can give you a little story and anecdote on that side, because we had one of the largest investment banking firms in the world, sort of powering a lot of their efforts. And, they had what once was basically a year-long onboarding program that was entirely in person. And they would say, listen, if you're co-located in these marquee offices around the globe, you had a brilliant experience. They loved it. CEO was the pride and joy of that entity. Without question, I can understand. And then March of 2020 hits, and now what? And what does that look like? And so the idea of being able to move that with a digital first mindset had to be all digital for that short form. But even the run they did this past year for, or just started the 2023, is absolutely a hybrid model, but keeping that digital first mentality allowed them to open the aperture to all of these additional folks that weren't within proximity from a sustainability standpoint, that we're having to fly people into offices, so that cost savings and just the stance that they were taking on CNS kind of internally as an organization and externally facing, huge benefit there. And it's not something they initially thought of being, well, we should design the program this way because we want to reach this wildly diverse audience. But now they're not going back. They're sticking with this sort of ability to, yes, have some in-person components when possible, but keep that digital first mentality because it opens the ability for so many others of disparate background audience.
I love the way you talked about that in terms of it opens the aperture of it, right? It's like, it's not about saying this or this. It's about saying, how do we expand this out for a broader reach? And, in one organization I was with, similar story to what you described with the onboarding, but the description I got from my global colleagues was, if you're not in corporate, you get the lunchbox version of the steak dinner. Everybody's going to Ruth Chris, and we get a, stale gas station roast beef sandwich, and it's like, hey,
the triangle
isn't
cutout
it great?
container,
And it's like,
the whole deal.
what, hey, we provide lunch to everyone. And it's like, well, no, this is a completely different thing. And I think what we're talking about here, by having that digital first mindset, is being able to say, okay, who says we have to have such a diverse experience between those two audiences, and actually making a better experience for everyone involved?
Yes, without question. And the other part of that, I know we'll probably get into some of this later, but that, that scaling piece, I think it's something else that sort of opened eyes, of L&D practitioners when they said, my goodness, I don't have the ability to sit everyone in a sort of physical classroom any longer, or take them to a destination on-site, off-site event. What am I going to do now? And I have, hundreds or thousands of sort of employees. I think of, industries like aviation that laid off tens of thousands of individuals, and then to watch it swing back only after 18 months and say, my goodness, we worked with one of the other largest aviation clients in the world, and they had some astronomical hiring. I think it was something to the tune of 9 to 17,000 employees in a 6-month span. I just can't fathom having, how are you going to bring them back into the fold of your organization, get them aligned, get them connected, and get them productive in the field now, because we have people showing up, at gates again.
So I'm trying to decide if I want to hit on the scale thing first.
You go wherever you want.
I know. Well, this is the thing. I'm going to. It's my show. I can do it. I'll take it wherever I want. But before we get into the scale piece, because I think this is a really important one, I want to talk about the difference in the design and architecture of this piece, because this is I'm in a lot of conversations where people are talking about this, and there's head nodding and experiences over time. We want to do more than an event. And it's like, but this isn't just repackaging what you've done before and delivering it in a different tool and going, hey, we had all this stuff in the LMS. Wow, we could chop this up and then put it in this other cool thing and space it out over a year, and poof, we've created the Ruth Chris dinner for everyone. And it's like, nope, that's not it. So I do want to talk about this, because you're at NovoEd, you are really invested industry-wise in helping build these skills for folks so that they can do this. Because if you don't build the skills and shift your mindset on this, and I've been in conversations with people like, I tried the whole cohort academy, it didn't really work. And I'm like, well, how about let's talk about what you did? Because in my experience, when you do it right, it's glorious in terms of what it can do. So I'm curious how you're approaching that.
It's a big shift without question. So two themes, and then maybe I can share a little bit about sort of how we're trying to approach this and sort of uplift the collective sort of global audience on this front, because it's a challenge. Make no mistake. I mean, that's how I cut my teeth. In sort of part of my master's was tied to instructional design. That's how I sort of came up through the ranks many years ago. But this idea of being able to apply intentionality and interactivity to content, not just chunk it up, is a radically sort of different approach for folks. So, one of the things we're doing at NovoEd, and we've done for the past few years, is run this LXD, learning experience design, open MOOC style, large cohort, literally powered and run on NovoEd.
I would expect nothing less. If you told me you weren't, I would be like, oh, not eating your own dog food.
At that point?
That's how that works. Turn it off.
But the idea of the appetite is out there for it, because that's the first thing I'd recognize. I think we typically have 1,800 or 2,000 folks sort of signing up for this. We applied to get SHRM credits that are tied to it. We're working with one of our brilliant partners in Credly, putting a certification on it, hopefully later this year for that. But the idea is, how do we get people to transition and sort of approach sort of new lenses to thinking about it's not just consumption sort of maps to mastery, or content equals learning, or skill equals capability. What does it really mean? So when you're designing for interactivity, what are the options that are there? When you've got that sort of short form piece of content, what are the wrappers you can put in, with, through, around it that then tie a human element? And there's a huge part about practice, and there's a huge part about feedback. And, obviously we're purpose built as a platform to pull those two pieces forward in a multitude of ways, but having people just think through from just a pure design, forget the technology for a second, about those points of intersection. When can I create opportunities for feedback? And it can be multiple variant. It can be peer only. It can be in a private fashion of a protected, safe nature into a manager or mentor. It could be sort of in a global gallery type style approach. Then when it comes to all the interactivity, what form does that take? Is it something simple and light, point of entry, like a social poll that says, okay, I feel comfortable exposing myself? Or is it far more expansive? We're creating mini team breakouts to allow a cohort of 1,000 to break down to a cohort in a sub team of 6 to have some intimacy as they sort of work through a design component in that long form sort of concentric circles over the arc of the journey. So it's a challenge, and make no mistake about it. But I think if folks really embrace and lean in to the sort of experience, emphasis on experience to the design, it goes a long way, certainly from then the learner recipient side on engagement, which I think we're all in pursuit of. Can we get people more engaged with our learning and training?
And engaged for the right reasons, because engagement for engagement's sake, I've been commenting on all these,
clicking on buttons.
Right. Like, okay, they responded to the poll, they did this thing, and it's like, right, but to what end? And did that actually add value to the experience? And I don't remember when it was probably a couple of years ago, but I had done one of these on moving from UX to LX and thinking differently as designers, instead of just thinking, how do we improve the user experience of what we're doing, to actually, no. Let's deconstruct the learning experience as a whole and be what you just described, relentlessly intentional about going, what are we really trying to do? And how are we building all of these different components into that experience? Because again, moving from knowledge to skills requires more than knowledge in different flavors. It requires that reflection, that collaboration, that feedback, that practice. And building all of those things in, this is higher order work. I mean, it is, and that's not to downplay that information architecture is hard in and of itself. That's a challenge in and of itself, but it is a higher degree of effort to say, all right, that's one thing. Now we got to turn up the volume because we got to go beyond that.
It's interesting because I did a webinar last week with one of our brilliant partners, GP Strategies, that we brought on as parcel of that no performance, no talent, and no experience design exceedingly well. And Kara Halter was sort of my guest on that as we hosted through NovoEd. And one of the themes that she was talking about as sort of hallmarks of that model learner is having that ability and that expectation to sort of execute in that way that you just described. And it's so important because I think folks are clamoring for that level of that collaboration and that feedback and those opportunities for practice and reflection. It becomes really, really important if you can design for it, because again, engagement for the right reasons. And then the learners are really leaning in, to that experience. And one of the things that struck me, as she said, if you're doing this right in your approach to practice and application, whether the tech's involved or not, and you're asking people in the arc of that experience to perform on multiple occasions with submissions, with evidence, with proof of work product, you've just signed off on Kirkpatrick level 3, and you didn't have to wait 6 months after the intervention.
You didn't have to wait.
And it was in there.
Right. You got it right. Well, and it's funny too, because again, going back to, is this really that big? I cannot overemphasize for anybody watching and listening, this is not a small, marginal change, maybe see slightly different results. It's huge. Just as an example, this was probably last year. I was running a thing with a group of leaders, and we were I love doing science experiments with this. And so we were doing some things to see how much does content really impact the experience? So we brought a group of diverse leaders, senior all the way down to frontline. And we brought them together, and we had built an experience that was less focused on the content. We're this is kind of general content. I don't know. But we're not going to put all of our eggs in, we got to get the content right. Because if the words are right and if we structure it perfect, then it's going to be. Right. We just said, we know we got to do it. We're going to make it accessible. We're not going to make that the focus. But where we're going to put our attention is on the collaboration and the going back and forth, the practicing different things and really doing that. And we're let's just do this real quick, spin this up and see what happens. And so we went through and we had some honest conversations with the leaders afterwards, and we said, how would you describe your feedback on that? And people's feedback on the content was all over the map. I've seen that a million times, I've already done that. Some people were wow, my mind was blown by that. But it was all over the map. So it was one of those that validated that it's like, we could spend a ton of time on this.
On crazy
but
production
realistically,
values, sourcing the best.
Right, like
premium
high
thing.
production, make
Yep.
sure, you got to get the right words and speakers and do it. But ultimately, everybody still was going like, I don't know, like it just really depended. Everyone said what I took from this was like this insight that this person shared, or when I practiced this and I realized and got feedback that this is an opportunity area I had never had. And universally, we asked him, would you do this again? Like, would you set aside time in your schedule to participate in this? Every single one said
unanimous.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
love it.
Yes. And thank you for not making it all about the content, even though some people were like, it was really helpful and I'll definitely reference it and use it and all that. So it didn't diminish the value of the content, but it emphasized the fact that sometimes we put way too much of our focus on perfecting, or we're like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Like, well, I don't know. What if we like put them over here? And it's like, there's an iceberg ahead. Like I don't know. Change the trajectory.
I think that, they're hitting on because like this human element. And if ever more palpable 3 years on into the pandemic, of the expectation that I want and need as an employee to connect with my peers, colleagues up, down, across the organization, it is massive right now. And whether it's tying to retention or mobility or just the sense of like well-being and purpose in the workforce, at the org, like people are clamoring for it. So again, a wildly high production value produced, slick videos and well-sourced content won't get you that
and
far.
There's a place for them. That's my thing with it.
Exactly.
People are like, so you're saying we should never do that? I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. Quit misquoting me on it. I'm not saying that's not important. And if you can do it, but I'm saying if you've got $10, don't invest 9 of them on that. And then one on the like, well, I don't know. We'll like throw a, Slido in the end and, make it a little engaging.
Call it interactive. Yeah.
No, like just balance the scales a little bit. And I think, and we won't go down this rabbit hole because this will be the red pill. And I've got a video later this week on it. But when we think about what's happening, what you brought up, what happened with the pandemic, more than ever, people are craving connection and human collaboration, which I get misquoted on this one too. Proximity is merely a variable in that equation. Can it be helpful? Agreement. Yes, but it's not spirit sprinkles and fairy dust that magically makes things happen. And so being able to focus on that coming out of the pandemic is huge. But also, when you think about what's happening with generative AI and its capability, it can do things better and faster than you can. When it comes to, hey, here's
rote creation,
100 pages of stuff. Can you summarize this in 3 pages and call out some of the main themes? Things that you would spend weeks pouring through, it could do in minutes. And that can be terrifying. But when you think about the fact that you think about all the things we just described on like, okay, how do we be intentional about these different elements? How do we design for this? How do we bring people together in a meaningful way? Before, you didn't have time to do that because you were so busy reading the 100 pages of stuff to figure out like, what is this thing? I don't even know what this is. You don't have to spend the time. And instead of clinging to that, being like, oh no, AI is going to take my job. Like, no, let it do it. Let it do it. And then you can use the insights from that to go, oh, now I can actually invest $8 into the experience. And I think that's a really important thing as we look at how technology is changing things dramatically.
Yeah, and I hope, for most L&D teams, I can say that because I'm a sort of recovering one in many ways of instructional designer, facilitator, instructor, is lean into that, because the idea this should be the advent of ChatGPT-4 and sort of robotics at its core, is it frees us up to do the nature of what we do best, which is the human element side of it. Yeah. And so getting into the design thinking and to the human side of that, and how can I create the most meaningful interactions that facilitate information exchange, and that's where the nature of, at least today, those AI models are struggling and will not be able to approximate what a human can do.
Yeah, so, I don't think there's going to come a day where we're ever going to want to turn over our critical thinking and decision making skills to AI. And I think that's just it. It's like those are the important things that we can spend more time doing that we didn't have the time to do before, because now it's helping us serve it up these things and go, well, here's some things you could think about that you can then think critically about and go, okay, who's our audience? How do we want to do this? How would we architect this in the technology?
Yeah,
okay. So I want to, this is a nice little lead into this, because now this leads to the scale piece,
right?
Because this is one of the historical things that some of the best intentioned design teams and L&D teams I've known over the years have said, we want to do more of this. One, there was the time thing, which generative AI should be able to help you immensely with that. But then there also was this, man, though, like running the complexity of these things.
Just executing a program.
Just pure execution of this with more. It's fine if you got 15 people in your class or 30 people. You start talking hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. Suddenly you just see people shut down and go, yeah, I mean, I'll do that with like our top 1% of leaders,
right.
But like, I'm not going to bring this to the masses, which is unfortunate, because then so many others, going back to the equity conversation, they just flat out miss out. So because this is an area you're focusing heavily on at NovoEd to help do this at scale. How are you helping this scale? Because it is challenging.
Massively. So this idea of we call it human interactions at scale, right? If the nirvana that folks that we moved from traditional sort of learning in ILT, it was wildly interactive, wildly immersive, wildly powerful, awful to scale. And then we sort of moved on up the trajectory to be like, wait, we'll make everything self-based. We'll make
it scalable, so we can just chop it into a video and then we push it out to everyone, and great. And it's like, well, now we sacrificed everything that people actually enjoy.
So there you go. So now we're trying and know to swing that.
Bring them back to the messy middle.
not messy middle, cleaner and up to the right.
Okay,
and we think of that idea of this human interaction at scale. And so being able to say, listen, if you want to run a cohort that has 100 people in it, and you need to do that 25 times a quarter because you're a firm of 40,000 people. It's another one of the big financial services firms that we have, runs 2,000 programs on the platform, 50 cohorts every month going through here of notable size. What are the tools and systems for the L&D, for the program leader and administrator, that we can put in place to ease that? So things like automated nudges and communications to bring people and habituate them back to the platform, or automated workflows for feedback, because if feedback is a really important, like you and I talked about, aspect of sort of intentionality of design, how can we create that if you can only have a manager come in, a quick look for 15 minutes at what I need to assess and who needs feedback, and then in and out of the platform. So, being able to just, again, our focus from a technology standpoint about empowering the ability to scale. So if you only want to put 20 folks through a cohort, you can, but if you want to put 1,000 folks through and then break them down into sub teams for intimacy and run that construct multiple times a quarter, you can. And it's not 4,000 spreadsheets and 18 Slack channels, and I track my Zoom recordings, and what do I do with the completion data, and did that get fed back to my LMS? That's a cohesive experience, and to do it at scale is really, really important. And I know there's lots of moving parts in there, and I won't get too into the feature functions.
No, but I think it's because a lot of the folks that listen to this and watch this it's a mix of folks, and some are on the more senior side, some are, doing the design work. And one of the gaps that I often see on the senior side is a lot of senior leaders didn't grow up in the space. And the unfortunate part with it is not that you can't lead learning if you haven't done it, but one of the gaps that you have is you don't always understand the intricacies and complexity behind this. And you're like, why can't we run this cohort for 1,000 people? Just do it. And it's like, what? Do you know how many emails and like
just the sheer nature of comms alone will bury it.
We don't have 1,000 people on our team to just. And so I think it is important that senior leaders who are thinking about this do think carefully about that, because it does make a big difference. And you can put, especially at a time when workforce burnout is at the highest level ever, you can burn your teams out by being like, well, let's just do it for more people, and not be like, well, but how actually are we going to do it? Because there is a lot of administrivia, and I think that's what you're hitting on. Massive administrivia that
and it's always, I think, always the idea, Christopher, that I see this, it's a bit of the cobbler's son, is that, the internal L&D teams that are having to execute on behalf of the business and those critical driving goals, the initiatives from the C-suite are often just told, we'll just use the technology. That's to make it really, really simple. Well, not all technology is created equal to do that. And if you just need Excel,
just have the LMS do that for you.
It'll take care of it for you. So, we put a concerted focus on those back end administrative pieces to make those streamlined so that you can have firms run, hundreds of cohorts on a quarterly basis with volume and still maintain a pristine level of interactivity and intentionality of experience. Because that's, at the end of the day, like, they're still on the hook for that, right? When it comes to the business. So that better have been a good experience for me, or I'm not going to come back, or I'm going to ask for something different, or I'm not going to accept the chargeback that you give to my LOB anymore.
Right. If I send my people through it and the experience blew, like, I'm going to be
you're not
too happy
getting any more. And the other big area maybe I can mention, and I wonder, I have to imagine that this is a challenge for you and for others, is this idea of both the content management side of the scaling aspect and the translation side. Two big areas that we've been focusing on. We've got a couple of things that came out in MVP this quarter around AI content translation at scale. So I'm not talking about UI and making it feel personalized in local dialect. I'm talking about literally, like, I author once, translate ad nauseum across based on specificity, and being able to do that is a massive scaling component, right? So now I can run a global onboarding program, and the folks that are, need it in Thai can be in Thai, and they want to interact and consume, but I, as an author, can only need to sort of, pen once. And I think that becomes really powerful with the content management. Oh, I made a change. Now I need to push that to the 1,500 permutations that exist out in the ether. Do I have to re-record all of my SCORM files that I produced in Articulate Rise, or can I, go forward now and sort of, use a focus here? So two other areas that I think speak to that scaling that are going to become more and more important.
Well, and what, just continuing to tie on this tech piece. And again, I love when we hit on this stuff because it helps illustrate how to use this technology well. So two that stood out to me on this that you mentioned was the automation of some of these nudging and kind of like reminding people to be engaged. Because the reality is people are busy. Like, a lot of people are well-intentioned on, I want to do this. I see value in it. I want to
develop myself,
I just forget. And I think of an experience where we had used, again, and I don't know what you have behind under the hood, but I've done some experiments with text nudging engines that they're talking to a bot, but the designers have architected the conversation flow. So it's not handing things over to the machines. We've architected it, but we know that, okay, this is the dialogue. These are the kinds of things that we want to ask. This is the feedback we want to give based on this. And again, that has allowed us to scale. And surprisingly, people are always like, yeah, nobody likes bots. But I'm like, I think you're operating off 20-year-old data in terms of when, you were calling AT&T because you had things. And it was like, no, that's not what I said, type of a thing. To, if you architect these things well, they can help you scale significantly and actually improve engagement, because it gives a pseudo-human experience. It's like, it can feel like somebody's talking, hey, did you have a chance to? And again, this is the intention and critical thinking we put into it, is going, how do we architect this to feel like someone's doing it? So that they're like, wow, I got reached out by someone.
Exactly. And the other two big dynamics, we put a huge focus on sort of designing the framework for our internal notification and nudging construct, was around behavioral kind of triggers and temporal triggers, right? So now it can be, this starts to feel the personalization where you don't have to have back the administrative load. Folks go back in and say, okay, well, who are the 600 that haven't gotten through to module 4 yet? In week 6 in the program, you can just auto program that experience. So if they haven't, they get plugged. And if they have, they don't. And now all of a sudden, that's the personalization we want. Not you recommended content to me like Netflix. No, you help me progress on this developmental opportunity, and that feels very unique. And if I've got an overachiever down the hall, then they don't get those push notifications. They don't get them on.
And a lot of that stuff is robotic. That's the thing. Like, sometimes there's this defensiveness to like, well, we should do that. It's like, do you really love running these reports and being like, I got to send an email to these 400 people who didn't do their assignment yet? Like, that's not something you're going, this is really value add time I'm putting into this. And I think that's the component. But the other one that you hit on there, the translation piece, to me is extremely encouraging. I did a panel last week where I talked about this and the possibilities of localization and scalability by saying, and you don't have to, again, that lunchbox version thing of going like, well, it's English because
deal with it. That's the business language.
Deal with it. Like, globally. That's all you get because that's what we got. It's like, what a tone deaf an insensitive message to send to people to go, we know you don't really speak this as your primary language, but figure it out. And I think I understand why we have, because that has never, no one in my experience has that ever been their attitude. It's just the scale, the cost, we change, like there's just no way for us to do it. And I think it's exciting to see, you know what, it's actually becoming something you can do quickly, effectively, and efficiently in a way that goes, wow, you actually designed this for me.
That's exactly. And the other piece, I think, when we look at it through our lens, Christopher, of the cohort component, a lot of us obviously was driven directly from our install base saying, listen, we've got these global cohorts and we hate is we're putting, 10 or 15 alone into this sort of isolated experience for this global onboarding, even though they're part of a function that is 3,000. Is there no way for us to sort of co-locate them? And so, our approach down this path was say, well, yes, now we can. So if they choose to, and their English is up to par and they want to sort of consume and interact on that fashion, great. If they're not, on a flip of a toggle, now they can interact in language of choice, but we've co-located that Thai speaker with the Vietnamese, with what's coming from Sweden, and all in one. And that,
and it's funny you bring that up, because this goes back to sometimes well-intentioned efforts for belonging
create isolation,
actually cause bigger problems, because it's like, hey, we want you to belong, so we've isolated you with a bunch of people just like you. So go over there with more people and it's like, wait a minute.
You ruined the opportunity for shared experience with all.
Right. Like, I can't imagine if people were like, oh, you're, Christopher, that dad guy who likes learning. You know what? Why don't you go over with the 2 other people on the planet like you and hang out with them, but you can't participate with anyone else? Like, it's actually a very isolating experience. And what's interesting, I love that you talked about the fact that you're focusing on allowing people the choice. And I think if anything, as we move into 2023 and beyond, this demand for personalization and defining what that looks like, which is autonomy. People want to be able to say,
big driver.
Look, maybe I do want to be alone over there by myself with the one other person, and I'm fine with that. I don't need to deal with all the other. And okay, that's your choice. But to somebody else who goes, please don't put me in that box. That's not the box I want to be in. Saying, you don't have to. You have accessibility to the rest of this if that's what you choose. And that is a powerful statement to send to your employees, to go, yeah, we've designed this to the best of our ability, but you have a choice in what this experience is like for you.
Yeah, the huge other driving kind of tenet, both of our investment, current state and future, around this idea that you touched on, Christopher, of cohesive experience and allowing that sense of choice. And so, we pushed out a little bit earlier this year our learning journeys, right? How do you kind of compile together this sort of experience for folks over a long form arc, but you allow some personalization, some individuality and choice into that. So making these, first several experiences and courses required versus this set, you get to pick 2 out of the 5, or these don't even unlock until you progress to a certain level, is, allowing those users to sort of navigate through that pathing perspective, based on their current state of knowledge, their understanding, their role in the business, how they're supporting a function. And so that just becomes so, I think, important on your point. And it's a different style of personalization than I think, at least where I came from in last role. And I think, if I'm making a bet, I think this is the better variant of personalization than just.
To me, it's a more accurate definition of when I actually talk to, because I am intentional about spending time. It's funny how much time sometimes we spend on like data analysis and research reports. And it's like, do you ever just set up time with your employees and like talk to them and just ask like, hey, and time again, when I have these conversations, this definition of what we're talking about in personalization, hands down, that's what they want. They don't want, oh, you're telling me that based on these criteria, you've predetermined this is more aligned to my thing. It's like, I want to feel like I have some weigh in on what matters to me, and that you've gone, we've accounted for that. We hear you, and we've accounted for that.
Yeah, and I think the biggest piece when we think of some of our biggest customers for NovoEd is we're not necessarily direct to the end user. Of course, we're wildly supportive of the learner. That's where we came from. Our origin story at Stanford Social Algorithms Lab. We care about the individual learner, but we care about the org, right? And that org wants connection, wants alignment, and some of the best ways to do that is to have some intentionality of design, but still allow that choice. So it's not a total for all in the experience, but you allow some uniqueness of progression, which I think.
But this goes back to the critical thinking of you're architecting where those fulcrum points are. And you're actually saying, you know what, where can we do this? And again, this goes back to the moving beyond knowledge to skills. When you're focused on outcomes and skills, there's a lot more fulcrum points.
Yes.
When you're only focused on the knowledge and the content, it's kind of like, well, you either watch it or you don't.
Yeah, there's only so many ways I can serve this up.
There's only like two choices, and you can't be like, well, choose to watch it or don't, because it's like, well, if you don't, then we have no. Versus if it's like, look, if you can do the thing, I'm not as concerned about whether you went through the pathway as we designed it, so long as you can demonstrate, you can do it. And
your submission for that effort, and then it got peer reviewed, and great,
wow, the stuff. I'm not going to clockwork orange you through like our content in an attempt to punitively punish you.
I can't believe you worked in a Kubrick reference into this one. That's next level. I love it. Bobby, smashing.
Sometimes I just feel like that's like the next solution. Sometimes it's going to come from L&D on engagement. It's like, well, you know what? There's this new vendor out there, and they created these glasses that.
It'll get you the behavior change you're after. If you want to see it in the work,
100% engagement. There's an attachment that zaps people. Yeah, people hate it, and it drives engagement down the toilet. But so this also then leads me to another thing that you hinted at backstage, because as you're talking about this higher focus on automation, this ability to translate, all these other things, a lot of these components, I can see challenges with some orgs going, right, but we build everything over here and it doesn't always play nice over here. So you had hinted that, this is something that's on NovoEd's radar of saying, how can we do more to help in the authoring space, to help craft some of this stuff that is more optimized to go with the experience. So I'm curious where you're looking at it and if that's part of kind of why.
Yeah, without question. So part of this is, let's make the lives of L&D or LOB leaders that are producing content and opportunities for training intervention far easier. So we think of today, a lot of authoring happens on the platform. We think of it as NovoEd is in many ways a no-code authoring tool that you don't have to have wild expertise in. Can it recreate in its entirety experiences of legacy authoring tools of the tune of Rise and Storyline? No, and there's a place and a time for those. So that's why we accept, take a SCORM output if that's what you're used to producing e-learnings in. But think about the intentionality then how you plug that in is an object and asset around an experience that you're driving after. But more and more we're getting pressed by our install base to say, well, what if I didn't have to use those other tools? Because not only can I kind of assemble and sort of amass on Nova, but I feel like I'm actually building there as well. Is that something that you all can sort of lean more deeply into? So I think you're going to see some exciting things for us in that, in that arena as the year unfolds, because, we're all in on that idea of that creator platform in support of L&D first and foremost, but also opening that aperture, not necessarily to the entirety of an organization, because there needs some intentionality, back to our opening part of the dialogue. But I think this idea of equipping and empowering others with sort of no-code authoring type approaches in a holistic, cohesive experience is going to be wildly important for enterprise organizations moving forward. How do we, amplify the efforts of L&D teams that are already thin and stretched? Let's empower others.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and I think what was interesting when you mentioned you were going here, to me, it was a natural pairing. Sometimes I talk to a lot of tech companies and I hear kind of what their plans are and their roadmaps, and am often very candid with my feedback on things. And,
as you are, I like it.
Which gets me in trouble and sometimes. But, the thing with it is, to me, when you said it, I was like, this makes sense for what you're trying to do for a couple reasons. One, like we said, as you continue focusing on the personalization of this stuff, it makes sense that rather than trying to import, and again, you've done a good job. I'm familiar with the platform. You've done a good job allowing for it to accept.
Third-party
okay, if you have
absolutely.
other things, you can bring things in. We're not trying to take it. We're not trying to take their market share. Yet at the same time, inevitably, when you're architecting an experience in something, it always creates disconnect when you're like, we got that other thing we got to go do, and then we got to do it, and then we got to bring it in, and we got to make a change. And so going back to efficiency and scalability, to me, the ability to say, not everything, but
Sure.
certain things, it makes sense that you go, you know what, we are fine. And I'm guessing you're looking at like, what are those things that people consistently are finding that friction and going, you know what, if we could build this in, would that make your life easier versus, hey, you don't need design tools for anything anymore. Like, well, like, no, that wouldn't make any sense.
It's back to our adage of, right, when we say digital first, we don't mean only digital. When we say authoring tools, we don't mean you can never use another authoring tool.
No.
We can always do that and then make it part of the cohesive experience in NovoEd. But just you said, there's probably those consistent experiences, activities, types of outputs that you want to author. And if you could do that directly in the platform without having to leave and disrupt your own workflow and get you more efficient, great, we're going to do that for you.
So. Yeah. No. And I think that makes sense. I think it also speaks to, and I'm curious on this one, it also speaks to, as the tech ecosystems continue to get complicated, explosive, and I've been in debates with significantly bigger voices than myself on this. And I'm kind of the minority report on it because, it's like, oh, it's all going to consolidate. And I don't see us going that way because when you actually understand the complexity of what we're doing, are certain things going to collapse in on themselves? Yes. And that makes perfect sense. But there is this need for diversity in the tech stack to be able to address some of these things where you go, well, you just can't do this in this kind of tool. And so it makes sense that you would go this path also in terms of when somebody's asking the question, well, why would we invest in a tool for this type of design? It's like, well, first of all, the experience itself is a justification, but now being able to say, hey, we may be able to optimize some of our operations, gain greater efficiency, and potentially consolidate some of our design tools as part of that process. That's just continuing to add value to the equation.
Yeah, without doubt, and that's a huge push for us. I mean, I might be lying. We'll be a minority report of 2. Then I guess that defies the definition of it. But it's the point solutions that are out there are continuing to be explosive. I think learning in this tech industry has produced there 1,200 discrete vendors that arguably are in the L&D HR talent space from a tech standpoint, and that was just
it's overwhelming.
It's overwhelming, and I fear for the folks when I was myself today having to make decisions about how do I navigate as I'm building out my tech stack in my ecosystem. But there is absolutely that saying that good enough is not good enough all the time. And so making intelligent decisions about the tech that you do bring in for personal reasons, if it can also support efficiency, allow you potentially to turn some other things off or reduce need and usage, for that sort of resourcing spend reduction is super important. So it's a big focus for us, and kind of ties in with our approach on ecosystem interoperability. Like make the investments that folks made, recognize that. Enterprises are big. They've made legacy, long-term, multi-year, multi-decade investments and they're not coming off them. So find a way to play nicely, to pass data, to exchange, to make sort of ease of reporting and tracking, all of those. Really pieces.
I was going to dig into the measurement one, and then I looked at the time and I was like, that's going to be another, right? I'm like, that's going to be another conversation in and of itself. But I do want to talk about the integration piece. And now that we've kind of hit on this, like, okay, interoperability, how does this stuff fit together within the ecosystem? How are you seeing organizations do this well? And I know you've been, again, really focused as an organization on saying, hey, we're not trying to be the panacea of ed tech. We recognize we need to fit in with this. But how are you seeing organizations start to plug this together? Because even going back to this efficiency and administrivia, that's always one of the risks of some of these things. And I've seen MacGyver cohort learning where it's like, well, we built it in Yammer, but we run it through Slack and we do, and it's like, holy cow, like you're spending 800 hours just in administrivia trying to keep, who did that part? I don't even remember. So how are you helping pull that together? Because oftentimes people do have these other systems that are their system of record or they're tying into things. How are people pairing this together to fit?
Yeah, so in the most exemplar way, and this is where nearly all of our clients are fitting into of a more mature nature, they've made investments. They have an LMS. They probably have had it for decades. They might have moved to a newer one recently, or they're sort of in another sort of 5-year rotation. They may have even purchased an LXP because at the time, a handful of years ago, aggregation discovery was top of mind and they needed some way as a better point of entry into the system. So we do not try to play as your system of record for your structured assets, in an LMS, your structured people data in HCM, or even trying to own the skills tsunami of taxo and folksonomy.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't tell me you're not getting into the skills tax.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's not. We think of those as those sort of external parameters. If I'm visualizing this, as your systems of record, maybe that system of discovery is your LMS. Maybe that is a primary front door for folks, or maybe it's an LXP. Where we fit is nesting directly inside of that as this, we think of it as system of engagement, right? So the cohesive experience is all happening inside of NovoEd. And when that experience ends, we're passing the transcript back into your LMS for tracking of unified record. When we need to define profile data for enrollment, we're pulling directly from your HCM. We just released our Workday integration on that front so that we don't have to recreate profiles and decide who gets exposure to this unique journey. We can do that based on entitlements. Are you in this geo, in region, in function? Perfect.
Okay, so you can actually start to validate credentials on, because your HCM has a lot of this stuff.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of waste in the system of well, geez, is this person eligible? Do we have record that they've done all this? Okay.
So that's a huge part. So the folks that are doing it right really are plugging us in that fashion as in essence, we are this platform, but this platform that plays seamlessly with the other investments they've made in terms of data pass back. And, for the folks that want to pull things out of NovoEd, we're moving much more to that sense of openness. So we published a whole bunch of APIs recently on, in terms of our advanced analytics. If you want to visualize those in NovoEd in the nature of how we do, extract, transform, and load, and how we present the data, wonderful. If you've got your own BI tool and your solution, you just want to pull the data out and mash it up with other data from your people systems, what have you, we'll give you that access to that event store data. So I think, the idea of being able to be playing, in that system of engagement, but being really open about the data that we allow in and read in together with the data that we push out is an absolute must. And at least, certainly for the large enterprises. And I would say even, kind of in the mid-market space, an expectation that you talk to multiple systems is just table stakes now.
Yeah, it pretty much has. And I would say the industry has gotten much better at this than they were, I don't know, 5 years ago, where the idea of
be in my
data,
system only.
I mean, you have to, right? It used to just be, well, if you're not in our system, yeah, we have an API, but basically you'd have
dust it off. And,
yeah, right. It doesn't do anything. And actually, if you tap into it, your house will light on fire. But, we can at least say, we can check that off the requirements list for your IT thing. So I think that's it has been a progressive movement forward. And what's interesting is the way you describe NovoEd. And when I think about it, when I hear the word learning experience platform, I actually think more of what you do than what the market category for learning experience platform is. And I get it's buzzwords.
It's a claimed term already.
I know, and someone with, like I said, a lot more followers than I did created the term, and then it became a big deal. But it really was one of these, when I think about learning experience, that's on a very personal level. How am I experiencing learning? And when you think about these big aggregate management systems, it's they're very impersonal, and that's not bad. Mm-hmm. It's just they serve a role, but that's not how I, as an employee, experience learning. That's where I go when I watch a thing and I, whatever. But when I think about what you do, to me, that's more no, that is a learning experience platform that's actually you're experiencing the learning in the platform.
We're going to reclaim the category. What do you think, Christopher? We started here at this point.
There you go. April 4th, 2023.
Let it be said.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Watch. The analysts aren't going to accept that one. So
no.
With one last thing before we go, just for anybody who's listening or watching, this can sound great, can be exciting, but if you had one tip for folks who are going, okay, we hear you, we think we would like to make more, what is a critical first step organizations can take to kind of go, how do we get started? Because a lot of times that's where I see people get paralyzed.
Yeah, super, super valid question. I think the greatest part about this is pick a really critical program, pick a name population that you believe has such critical focus for the organization, and try this experience. You do not have to create cohort learning across your entire organization and all functions, and the entire catalog and portfolio doesn't have to translate. But pick that one that you think has a high degree of human interaction, a criticality of basically sort of performance readiness to execute in the field, and cannot be accomplished and has not maybe to date through just rote consumption off of existing technology. That's a great starting point. And it doesn't have to be, tens of thousands of people to start. But, think about that's a sort of great way to dip your toe. And please take the free course on learning experiences. Send teams through it.
Okay.
Our next run starts, I believe, next week. I think we're still accepting registrations for that one.
Okay. Well, there you go. There's the call to action. If you don't know what this is, you got that. And the reason I was smiling as you were describing that, because it's totally great feedback, right? Pick the one thing and get started on it. I'm laughing because I was just thinking, and don't let that one thing be your annual compliance training. Just
please
let me be the first to say, don't pick that annual compliance training that you have to roll out and go, let's make this an interactive learning experience.
Your SOC 2 training is now brought to you by NovoEd.
That would not be a good use case. So please,
pick a different one. Right.
Pick something. Something other than that. Any other one than that. All right. Well, Todd, this was fantastic. I enjoyed it as always. Thank you for making the time. Thanks everybody for watching and listening, and hope you got something out of it. We will see you next week.
Appreciate you, Christopher. Thanks so much.